Hi, in this video we are going to start talking about how to beat the SAT essay. So here's how our training for the SAT essay is going to work. Oh, wait, actually, sorry, I just realized that only says SAT. Let me add the word essay there. Okay, so yeah, here's how our training for the SAT essay is going to work. We have 3 videos for you, and these videos are designed to show you how to take your current level of writing ability and then maximize the SAT essay score that you can get out of that. So in these videos, my goal is not to teach you how to be a better writer in the real world. And there are a lot of reasons why I'm not going to teach you that in these videos, but the 2 biggest reasons are that, first of all, it's not something you could teach in a couple of videos. Like, being a good writer is a lifelong pursuit, just like being a good artist or a good dancer or a good engineer or any other kind of lifelong discipline like that. But the second reason, and the biggest reason, the most important reason, is that becoming a noticeably better writer is not super likely to help you on the SAT essay anyway. Because, as you'll see throughout these videos, what the SAT essay rewards is not writing ability in the sense that we would normally think of somebody like Hemingway or somebody as being a good writer. That isn't what the SAT essay is about. And since, as I just mentioned, you can't really teach somebody to write like that in a couple of videos anyway, we're not even going to attempt anything along those lines. All we are going to be talking about in these videos is how to make your SAT essay score as high as it can possibly be. And we're going to do that over the course of 3 videos. Like I said, in this video, we're going to talk about how the SAT essay works as like a testing instrument for the College Board, what the unwritten rules are for the test, what the graders are thinking about when they look at your essay, and all of that kind of stuff. And you may be wondering what I mean by "if you even need to" here in parentheses. Give me a second. I'm going to explain that. But so yeah, in this video, we're going to be talking about the general strategic and tactical approach to beating the SAT essay. And part of that approach is going to involve thinking about concepts like evidence and reasoning and emotional appeals as they apply to the SAT essay in particular. In video 2, I'm going to break down all of that. If I put all of the stuff from video 2 into video 1, then first of all, it would interrupt the flow of this video. And secondly, it would make this training video be the length of like an independent movie or something. So we don't want that. And in video 3, we're actually going to look at some perfect scoring SAT essays that the College Board has provided to the world as examples of things that test takers have written in the past and the College Board has given perfect scores to. And we're going to go through those essays, keeping in mind the things you learned in the first 2 videos, just so I can show you how those example essays are actually doing the things that appear in the other 2 videos and not actually following the College Board's own rules and scoring rubric and stuff like that. But we'll get into how all of that works. Before we tackle any of this stuff, there's something extremely important that I want to make sure you're very aware of, because if you're watching this video, there's a chance you might not be aware of it. And that is the following question. Should you even be watching this video? Is this video even something that needs to be part of your life? And the reason I'm asking you this is that the vast majority of colleges and universities don't require the SAT essay at all. And when I say they don't require it, I mean, literally, if you ask them, hey, do I have to take the SAT essay to apply to your school? They say, no, we don't care about it. And in a couple of minutes, we'll explore why so many colleges and universities don't care about the SAT essay at all. But for right now, just take my word for it, or look it up if you feel like. Most schools that you could be applying to don't care if you take the SAT essay. And if you submit your SAT essay score to those schools, they are very upfront about the fact that they won't even bother to look at it. They don't consider it important or relevant to the admissions process for them at all. And you might be thinking, well, okay, yeah, but I'm applying to some really competitive schools, and I'm sure that they would want me to take the SAT essay. There are some competitive schools that do want you to take the SAT essay, just as there are schools all across the spectrum, all the different tiers of colleges, that may or may not want you to take the essay. But you will find that a number of the most prestigious and highly competitive schools don't care about the SAT essay at all and are very upfront about that. Among the most notable schools that don't care about the SAT essay is Harvard, which even accepted SAT essay scores for years and then finally just said in 2018, we're not really looking at this. We don't want you to send this anymore. And that leads me to my next point. Even for colleges that say they require the SAT essay, if you look at the data and all of the anecdotal evidence that's available, even the ones that say, yeah, send us the essay score, we require it, even those schools don't actually seem to look at what the score is. And let me explain why they would bother to tell you that they require it and then not look at it, first of all. And secondly, let me also explain how we have a very strong idea that they're not actually considering the essay score. First of all, the reason why they might say you have to send the essay, even though they aren't maybe planning on looking at it, is mostly to do with perception and appearances and reputation. As part of their marketing and their branding, their reputation management, all that kind of stuff, colleges and universities generally want people to think that they value a certain core set of academic skills. These would include skills like reading carefully, being able to do math, being scientifically literate, having some level of appreciation for the arts, perhaps, depending on the school. And certainly the ability to write well is a thing that a lot of colleges and universities really prize. And they both actually do prize it, and they want everyone to know that they prize it, because you can't run a school effectively if you just sort of have this air of not seeming to care whether your students can write. Writing is considered to be a very important part of education, being able to think clearly and all of that kind of stuff. And so with that in mind, a lot of schools seem like they want to avoid a situation where they would seem to be telling their applicants, we don't really care how well you can write. They want to give the appearance that they care very much about how well their applicants can write. And so it seems like they don't want to say, yeah, I know there's an optional essay, but we don't care if you do the optional essay. We don't really care about your writing skills. That's the message that they seem like they don't want to send. And so I think for a lot of schools, this is why schools do require the SAT essay. And again, we can go back to the example of Harvard. For multiple years from 2015, when the new version of the SAT essay was created, Harvard was like, yeah, send us the SAT essay, we require it. And then finally, a couple of years after that, in 2018, Harvard was like, you know what, we've been saying that we want this thing, but it's really not very valuable. You don't have to take it. Don't send it in the first place. And that leads me again to the second part of why we can be pretty sure that even when a college requires the SAT essay, the college doesn't seem like it actually looks at the score or considers the score in its admissions process. And the most telling issue with that is that schools and ranking agencies don't ever talk about what the average SAT essay score is for admitted students anywhere, as far as we can tell. So in other words, if you, say, want to apply to a particular target school and you do some research to see what the standardized testing requirements are for that school and what the average scores are of the admitted applicants, even if that school says that it requires the SAT essay, when you try to find out what the average SAT essay score was of the people who were admitted, the school won't tell you. Like, there isn't anywhere that you can go and find that number, even though the school will tell you our average ACT score of admitted students was this, and our average SAT score of admitted students was that, and our average GPA of admitted students, average class rank. It will give you all of that data, but they won't tell you what the average SAT essay score was, which strongly suggests that they don't care what the average SAT essay score was. We can assume that they only care about the data that they do track and report. Plus, anecdotally, you won't find any examples of people who had relatively weak applications, relatively low GPAs, or relatively low test scores relative to the applicant pool for a particular college that they applied to, and then had a really high SAT essay score and still got accepted. You're not going to find a situation where the SAT essay score is the deciding factor in that respect. And in the opposite direction, you will find people who were solid applicants relative to the rest of the applicant pool in terms of test score, GPA, and all of that kind of thing, who had not great SAT essay scores and still got into very selective colleges. So it really seems to be the case that no one is viewing the SAT essay as a make or break part of your application. And it's also clearly the case that no one tracks or reports any of the SAT essay data. So we can conclude from all of that that the most likely situation is that no colleges are looking at the SAT essay score. And that even seems to go for the small number of colleges that actually do require the SAT essay. And by the way, at the time that I'm recording this, the number of colleges that requires the essay is like under 10% of the available colleges in the United States. And that number is only getting smaller. So we're only seeing reports like where Harvard was like, yeah, we used to require this, but you know what, we're not even going to pretend to require it anymore. And so now don't even bother to send it. That's the only direction in which schools change their policies. No schools go from not requiring it to being like, oh, this is actually super useful, we should start requiring this. No schools do that. They only go in the direction of they used to require it and now they don't. So all of that goes back to the question, should you even be watching this video? In other words, should you even care what your SAT essay score is? Maybe you should. You may have your own reasons for wanting to score well on the SAT essay. For example, maybe a large part of your admissions campaign is trying to show yourself as a good, disciplined writer. And maybe as part of that, you're applying to a school that requires the SAT essay and you don't want to show up with a bad SAT essay score, while the whole point of your admissions campaign is that you're a good writer. And again, even though that would probably not be such an issue, because I really suspect that most schools just completely ignore the SAT essay from the beginning, you may have your reasons for wanting to do well on it. Or it may even be that you've already got a perfect score on the multiple choice portion of the test and you want a perfect essay score to go along with that. Or whatever. The world is full of all kinds of people. And if you want your SAT essay score to be higher, then I'm here to help you with that. And it's completely up to you why you would want that. But if you are in the situation that the vast majority of test takers are in, which is just that you want the best possible standardized test scores that you can have to get into the schools that you most want to get into, if that's all you care about is just getting into the best school you can get into, then I can say with a high degree of confidence the SAT essay has almost no impact, probably actually zero impact on your ability to get into the schools that you want to get into. And so if it were me, if you're asking me for advice, which I guess you kind of are, or else why would you watch this? I wouldn't personally work on the SAT essay until my practice scores on the rest of the SAT, the multiple choice portion of the SAT, were as high as I could possibly get them. Because improving your SAT score definitely has a clear, directly measurable impact on your chances of getting into any school. While again, the SAT essay seems to have zero impact at all on your chance of getting into any school. So if you can improve the multiple choice more than you already have, then I would go back and focus on that. Again, just me personally, that would be my advice. But that doesn't mean that I can't teach you how to get a high score on the SAT essay, which is what the rest of this SAT essay video training will be about. So with this very important disclaimer, now very importantly disclaimed by me, if you continue to watch the rest of these videos and get your SAT essay score really high, well, you can't say I didn't warn you. So now let's go ahead and actually talk about how to beat SAT essay now that I've gone through a whole screen's worth of information about why that may not even be an important thing for you to do. So as we have done for every other part of the SAT, let's talk about what the College Board is trying to accomplish with the SAT essay, because as with every other part of the SAT, once we understand what the College Board is trying to accomplish and we understand the limitations on the College Board's ability to accomplish those goals, then we can understand the proper plan of attack and we can know how to raise our scores as quickly and efficiently and effectively as possible. So think back to the intro video for this entire course where we talked about the role of the SAT in the admissions process, how it provides reliable, objective, consistent data, and all of that kind of stuff. And one major thing we talked about in that video was the importance of the multiple choice format in helping the SAT play its very critical role in the admissions process. Well, if you keep all of that stuff in mind, it becomes pretty clear right away that an essay doesn't fit with any of that. Like the whole point of the multiple choice portion of the SAT is that questions are written in a very formulaic, rule-governed way. They have very clear black and white answers. You know, the answer is either definitely right or it's totally wrong according to the College Board standards. And that standard for the multiple choice part of the test can be applied with perfect accuracy to an infinite number of people. Well, an essay test doesn't allow that at all, right? The whole point of an essay is that it is subjective. It's not black and white. And different test takers will find different ways to express their thoughts. And their thoughts will be probably a little bit different from test taker to test taker. On top of that, when you have an essay, the essay has to be graded by human beings. And you can't have the same person grade every single essay, which means the same set of standards cannot be applied perfectly to every single essay in the way that they could be applied for a multiple choice test. So the essay feels a little bit tacked on to the rest of the test, right? The SAT was just sort of doing its thing with multiple choice for decades. And then suddenly now, for the last couple of decades, there's an essay test attached. You may be wondering why that is. Well, as with many things in the world, it comes down to the fact that in the early 2000s, the College Board felt like its very reason for being was kind of being threatened and called out by some people in the industry it served. And so the College Board decided to make a change. In the early 2000s, the guy who was at the time, I believe, the president of the State University System of California, pretty sure that's what he was. I could look it up, but it doesn't matter. Just somebody who was like super powerful and influential in the admissions business. He published an open letter to the College Board in which he laid out several problems that he had with the SAT at the time in the early 2000s. And one of his biggest problems was there's no writing component of the SAT. And he said a lot of the things we just talked about on the previous screen. He said, basically, for the universities that I'm in charge of, writing skills are super important, and it's hard to justify using the SAT when there's no direct measurement of writing skills. And at the time that he was making this complaint publicly, the schools that he was in charge of accounted for something like 1 in 5 college applicants in the United States or something. So basically, this guy was saying 20% of the people who apply to a college in the United States are applying to a college that I'm partially in charge of, and I would really like there to be some kind of writing instrument as part of the SAT. So, not surprisingly, the College Board decided shortly after that public demand to add an essay to the SAT. And the essay was first added in 2005. which is like a long time ago relative to you if you're watching this video as a test taker, probably, but not really that long ago in the history of the SAT, which goes back in one form or another to like the 1800s. So, relatively speaking, relative to the entire lifespan of the SAT, the essay is a pretty new development since it was first added in 2005. And the version that was added in 2005 was not well received by anybody. Many college administrators spoke out about how bad that version of the SAT essay was. One of them, a guy who was the head of undergraduate writing at MIT, if I'm not mistaken, actually said in a quote, "The SAT essay rewards all the things that we would like to punish in student writing and punishes all the things that we would like to reward." And so it basically teaches our kids to do exactly the types of things we don't want them to do when they write for us in college. So that version of the SAT essay lasted for about 10 years. And then in 2015, there was another overhaul of the SAT. And part of that overhauling process involved changing the SAT essay, which again, ever since 2005, had basically been seen as a failure. Now, in that overhaul from 2015, the overhaul that produced the current version of the SAT essay, the one that I'll be training you for in these videos, in that overhaul, a ton of stuff was changed on a superficial level. If you're the average test taker or teacher or just anyone else who doesn't think about this stuff obsessively like we do, if you're most people, it would look like the current version of the SAT is drastically different from the previous version of the SAT. As we'll see throughout these videos, the current version still has its flaws and is still relatively easy to attack. But rather than get rid of it in 2015, it seems like the College Board thought, well, we don't want to give the impression that we don't care about whether our test takers can write well. So we aren't going to scrap the SAT entirely. Instead, we're going to dress it up and make it seem like it's a bit different from how it used to be. And there's also apparently a financial aspect to all of this, because at one of the education conferences that I attended, there was talk about how the College Board was hoping that it could maybe get some states to use the SAT essay as a statewide testing instrument, rather than having certain states develop their own statewide measurements. And of course, if the College Board were able to do that, it's probably worth some money. So there's all of these reasons to sort of keep the SAT essay around. But one of the main reasons is not that schools seem to find value in it. As I mentioned earlier, less than 10% of the colleges in the United States require the SAT essay. And so that's basically what the SAT essay is for, even though the essay really doesn't fit with what the SAT actually does well, which is provide reliable objective data like we keep talking about for the rest of the test. Even though the essay doesn't go along with that, the essay does help the College Board present itself as an organization that cares a lot about test taker writing ability and stuff like that. So that's why it seems like the SAT essay still exists. The next thing we have to talk about in order to figure out how to beat the SAT essay is why the test is designed the way it is. So, as we just discussed, the original version of the SAT essay, the one from 2005, was widely criticized for rewarding the wrong stuff and penalizing the wrong stuff and just generally not being a very good test of writing ability. So it seems very much like the College Board took all of that stuff into consideration when they overhauled the SAT essay in 2015, and they tried to come up with a new format that would be harder to game in the way that the original format of the SAT essay could be gamed. And in fact, at the time that I'm recording this, if you go to the College Board's webpage about the SAT essay, it repeatedly mentions the idea that in 2015, the essay was completely overhauled and it's a totally different type of thing from what it used to be, and all of that kind of stuff. But as we'll find out, all that has really changed is the way in which you can easily beat the SAT essay without really being a fantastic writer. So, in other words, the College Board has not managed to change the fact that the SAT essay is a poorly designed test of writing ability. All they've arguably done is change the way in which it's poorly designed. And this all kind of makes sense if we keep in mind the challenge facing the College Board when it tries to design an SAT essay that can be given to huge numbers of people and still somehow be graded in some kind of almost standardized kind of way, despite the fact that no two test takers are going to form sentences in the same way or have the same kinds of thoughts, and the fact that no two graders are exactly the same person either, and all of those other kinds of complicating factors. Since the College Board isn't really equipped to give meaningful essay tests to people and then grade those responses in a meaningful, insightful, detailed kind of way, then there must be weaknesses in any kind of SAT essay format that the College Board comes up with. And whatever those weaknesses are, there's going to be some sort of way that we as trained test takers can exploit those weaknesses and to raise your SAT essay score as effectively and efficiently as possible. And so now let's talk about how we're actually going to do that. As we just said, the major challenge facing the College Board with the SAT essay is basically the conflict between the fact that the whole point of the SAT is to provide reliable, consistent, highly precise data on a huge scale year after year after year, but the whole point of an essay test in real life is to allow for things like subtlety and nuance and slight differences from one test taker to another. Or to put it more simply, the College Board's real challenge is that the strength of the SAT is its objective, reliable, black and white nature. But essay tests are inherently subjective. They don't fit with what the SAT is good at all. We also know that the College Board is not very upfront about what actually succeeds on the SAT, and we've seen tons of examples of this all throughout this video course, such as the fact that the College Board never tells us that the most important skill in the math section is actually critical reading, or the fact that the writing and language section doesn't test the passive voice, or, a million things like that. And so what we'll find here with the SAT essay is that the official essay scoring rubric provided by the College Board doesn't actually give us any useful information on what actually scores high on the SAT essay. So if you look at that rubric, for example, you'll find that it mentions things like the idea of being thorough or skillful or insightful in your writing, which are, first of all, very hard to define concepts. And secondly, if you look at the top scoring essays, it's really pretty debatable whether you could say that those essays are any more thorough or skillful or insightful than some of the essays that don't score high. But what you will find is that top scoring SAT essays do tend to have certain things in common, and we'll explore these more in the coming screens, but things like the way they tend to be structured, or how long they tend to be, or the percentage of each essay that's devoted to quotes of the passage, and so on. But what we'll find is that these reliable indicators of a high score on the SAT essay are actually not reflected in the College Board's grading rubric at all. So the rubric will mention things like the idea of the author being skillful or thorough in the way that she writes, but it doesn't mention things like the idea that you should strive to write at least 2.5 handwritten pages if you want a top score. And like I said, we'll find that the things that are mentioned in the rubric aren't necessarily going to be found in top scoring essays, but there are things that reliably indicate that an essay should score high, and those things are not mentioned in the rubric. So the rubric doesn't mention what it needs to, and does mention a lot of things that it doesn't need to mention. And so all of that means that we're basically going to ignore the College Board's provided rubric in figuring out how to attack the SAT essay, just as we ignore basically everything else the College Board says about the SAT and focus instead on what the SAT actually does over and over and over again. Right? Like when it comes to critical reading, the College Board says that the SAT rewards the same types of skills that are rewarded in advanced high school and college classes, but we know now that's not true at all. Instead, what the College Board rewards on reading comprehension is the type of black and white, literal-minded reading that was really popular in second grade. And similarly here, they talk about how they reward insightful, skillful, thorough types of writing. But what you're actually going to find is that objective, measurable things like these are actually what get consistently rewarded. So we're going to ignore the rubric again, and we're just going to focus on imitating the aspects of high-scoring essays that appear over and over and over again. And we have two sources of essays to rely on that allow us to know which elements to imitate. One source, of course, is the sample high-scoring essays that are provided by the College Board. And the other source is the experience of students and clients that I've worked with, which continue to bear out the effectiveness of the approach you're learning in these videos. And we'll get into the nuts and bolts of that approach in just a moment. But first, I want to start our discussion of the way that we'll attack the SAT essay by briefly refreshing you on just what the basics of that whole essay task are, in case you're not familiar with them. So on the SAT essay, and this is a very critical thing that a lot of test takers don't really appreciate the first time they hear it. On the SAT essay, you are not being asked to make your own argument about the topic that's described in the passage. So every SAT essay prompt is going to include a passage that's around 700 words or so that you will read. And if you were given something like that to read before writing an essay in a high school class, like a history class maybe, or a literature class or something, a lot of the time the teacher would include that long passage and then have you write your own thoughts or counter argument or something on the same topic that's covered in the provided passage. That, again, is how it would often be done in a school setting, college setting, whatever. But on the SAT essay, when you're given this passage, it is not your job to come up with your own argument related to the argument that you find in the passage. Instead, when you write your essay, all you're going to be doing is analyzing the way the argument is made in the provided passage. So, for example, I'm just making up something here, but let's say that the provided passage is about the idea of rescuing beached whales, and the writer of the passage is a scientist, and the scientist is making the argument that you should not save a beached whale. And maybe that argument is based on the idea that you're not going to help the whale anyway, and it's like risky for the people doing the saving, which, by the way, I'm just making up. I don't know anything about beached whales. If you want to save them or not save them, don't be swayed by my argument. But let's say that the passage, again, is providing an argument as to why people should not save beached whales. And maybe an untrained test taker is reading this who sort of forgets what the prompt is about. A lot of people, while they were reading that passage, would be thinking to themselves, no, you should save beached whales. I'm going to write an essay explaining why you should save beached whales. The people who are going to read your essay, they don't want to hear your opinions on the ideas in the passage or your direct reaction, your counter argument to whatever is presented in the passage. All they want to hear is your discussion, your analysis of how the passage itself is structured. How does the author of the passage put forth the argument that's in the passage? So you're just discussing that. Nobody cares whether you agree with the argument in the passage or not. And the passage that you'll be provided, as we mentioned, is going to be roughly 700 words. It's going to have all kinds of different evidence in it. So here I've listed some common types of evidence. We'll explore more what these different types of evidence are and how to talk about them in the video that I mentioned that's going to be specifically about dealing with evidence and reasoning and things like that for the essay. But for now, just know that the passage is going to include a selection of different types of evidence, probably not all of the three things that I listed there, but at least one or two of them for sure, and maybe other types of evidence as well. And the passage will also include appeals to emotion or just stylistic flourishes, little turns of phrase and ways of wording things that will be designed to kind of make the reader feel whatever emotional response the author wants the person to have when they're considering the argument in the passage. And since we know beforehand that the passage will have these features, again, it'll be roughly 700 words, and it'll have these kinds of evidence and some emotional stuff in there, since we already know that that's what the passage is going to include, then of course we'll take that into account when we're game planning how we're going to write the SAT essay. And finally, one other thing just to be on the lookout for when you look at the prompt for the SAT essay is that the prompt itself will tell you what the author is trying to prove in the College Board's opinion. So in other words, you're not going to have to read the passage and decide on your own what you think the passage is trying to argue, and then write your analysis of how well the argument that you think exists is being made or whatever. You don't have to come up with your idea of what the author is trying to prove in the passage, because the College Board will just spell out for you in one of the sentences in the prompt exactly what it considers the argument to be about. So here is an example of how that works on one of the official practice essay prompts that's available from the College Board's website. It says, write an essay in which you explain how Paul Bogard, or Bogard, I don't know how he says his name, Paul B., builds an argument to persuade his audience that natural darkness should be preserved. So the way this sentence is written, whatever comes after the word that's going to be the direct statement of what the College Board considers the passage to be arguing. So in this case, we would know, for whatever passage this was pulled from, that the passage we would be reading is an argument that natural darkness should be preserved. And then we could structure our entire discussion of that essay based on that idea. And then you wouldn't have to be wondering while you're reading it, well, gosh, I think he's talking about how natural darkness should be preserved. Maybe he's talking about how streetlights are bad, or maybe he's specifically talking about how stars are pretty at night. You might be wondering which of those things the College Board considers to be the actual central argument of the passage if you didn't have this prompt in front of you. So always look at the provided prompt from the College Board to find out exactly what the College Board considers the argument to be about. So that wraps up all of the basic stuff of the essay. These are all of the sort of obvious things you would know from just looking at the essay right away. So now let's move into the less obvious stuff, the stuff that we are going to do, as I said earlier, to imitate the top scoring SAT essays so that you can maximize your score on the essay portion as quickly and easily as possible and not get bogged down in trying to follow the rubric, which, like we said before, has basically no bearing on what the SAT essay score actually is. Anyway, so yeah, when we're talking about reverse engineering top scoring SAT essays, there are basically 7 key features we're going to find consistently appearing in the top scoring SAT essays. And of course, that basically means there are going to be 7 tactics or techniques that we'll use when we write the SAT essay to make sure that our essays will have those key features. I'm going to discuss those features on this screen really quickly, and then over the next 7 screens, we'll get into a bit more detail about what I mean by each of them. So the first tactic is we want to use the College Board's statement of the passage's thesis. We want to use the College Board's statement of what is being argued in the passage. We mentioned that a second ago, but I'll get into it more on the next screen. The second technique is that we always want to be stating in our essay that the author did a good job of making whatever argument the author was making. The third thing to keep in mind, and this is actually not really a tactic or a technique or whatever, so that's poor labeling on my part, but anyway, the third thing to keep in mind, which will affect how we do the rest of the stuff, is that we need to keep in mind that each of the 2 people who will read your essay are going to spend roughly 1 or 2 minutes on the process of reading your essay, or, maybe 3, 4, 5 minutes at the very most, but they're not going to be spending 20 minutes or half an hour. They're not going to spend anywhere near as much time reading your essay and digesting it as you are going to spend writing it. They're going to spend roughly enough time to glance through it quickly, get a strong idea of how it is structured, and then they're moving on. Another key tactic is that it's really important to write at least 2.5 pages, because we'll find that length is the #1 attribute that correlates to the score received on the SAT essay. The next tactic is that you're going to want to use a variation of the 5-paragraph format. If you don't know what that is, don't worry, we'll talk about it in a minute. If you know what it is, well then use it, but we'll still talk about it in a minute. And we also want to remember that some mistakes in things like spelling and grammar and word choice and so on are perfectly okay on the SAT essay. A large part of why they're perfectly okay, I think, is this thing here, that most of the people who are reading your essays are not actually reading them, so they don't catch the mistakes. But whatever the reason is, we'll talk about that later. And then finally, you'll want to structure your analysis in such a way that roughly 10 to 15% of your essay should be quotations from the passage that you're analyzing. You don't want to have too much more than that, because then it will mean that you're not really writing enough analysis. And you don't want to have too much less, because then it will mean that you're not pulling out enough examples from the passage to support whatever you're trying to say. So that's an overview of the main 7 things to keep in mind. Now I'm going to go a little bit more into detail on each of those things by giving each thing its own screen, but we're not going to spend a ton of time discussing each of those things. So again, the first one is we want to use the College Board's statement of what the argument is trying to prove. And let me pull that example prompt back up that we talked about a second ago, where we said that everything after the word "that" in this sentence is a direct statement of what the College Board considers the passage to be proving. And before we bother reading the passage, we always want to zero in on what this phrase is in the prompt, so that we'll know then what we should be looking for in the passage. That's going to save you a lot of stress, because you won't have to wonder if you're taking the right message from the passage or not. And when you do read the passage, it's going to make it easier for you to figure out how each part of the passage is supporting the main argument. And finally, this tactic is going to make sure that your thoughts are aligned with what the grader is expecting to read about, because the grader, remember, is going to spend 1 or 2 minutes-ish reading your essay, and he's going to expect it to be talking about the argument that he knows is in the passage. But if he looks at your essay and sees that you thought the passage was talking about something a little bit different from what it's supposed to actually be talking about, then he's not going to take the time to say, oh, well, this is kind of a fresh take on this. Let me pause my life here and really dig into what this person has written. No, he is just going to say, well, I only have about a minute to finish this, and clearly the author of this essay didn't even know what the passage was arguing, so I have to give this person a low score and move on. That's the kind of reaction you want to avoid, of course. So we want to stick to whatever the College Board says is the thing being argued in the passage, and just channel all our thoughts and our energy in that direction. And speaking of that, when we do start analyzing how well the author has constructed the argument within the passage, we are always going to take the position that the author constructed a good, solid, valid argument. Even if we don't particularly feel that way, or even if we don't actually agree with what the author is saying, I would still strongly encourage you to write your essay so that it says the passage creates a solid argument. And the main reason to do this is that every single high-scoring essay I have ever seen does it. And by the way, I meant to mention this on an earlier screen, but I forgot. You'll notice that throughout this video, we're talking about sample essays, meaning the essays that the College Board provides as examples of what a good essay looks like. It is true that every single one of those that's available at the time that I'm making this video takes the position that the passage contains a good, solid argument. But I want to throw in there, I'm not just talking about the ones that are available from the College Board, I'm also talking about the top scoring essays that have been written by my clients, and those also always take the position that the author's argument is solid. So since our goal is to copy the main features that are commonly found in top scoring essays, you want to copy this one. You want to say that the author of the passage did a good job in making the argument that appears in the passage. And one other reason to take this position, even if you maybe don't feel that way, is that taking this kind of position makes the whole process of writing your essay a lot more straightforward. And it's almost kind of necessary. Like if you read the prompt and read the passage, the College Board never picks like the ramblings of some sleep-deprived outsider to be the substance of the passage that they give you. Instead, they're always going to pick an author who has some knowledge of the points made in the argument and some degree of credibility and so on. And so it would be hard anyway to write a sincere analysis that came to any conclusion except that the author did a decent job making the argument in the passage. And so for both of these reasons, we can probably say that the grader is expecting top scoring essays to say that the author of the passage did a good job making the argument. So since all of the evidence suggests that's what the grader would expect, that's what you should do. Just go ahead and take the position in your analysis that the argument is solid. And speaking of the graders, remember what we said about how much time the graders are likely to spend on your essay. Basically, each grader is going to read your essay in a couple of minutes, certainly less than 5 minutes. And that often surprises people when they first hear it, because a lot of untrained test takers make the same incorrect assumptions about the essay that they make about the entire SAT, which is the incorrect assumption that the College Board would probably grade things in the same way that your teachers or professors would grade things in high school or college. And if you apply that incorrect assumption to the SAT essay, then you would assume, of course, that your essays would be read by people who paid a lot of attention to what you had to say and who probably weren't in a huge rush to grade papers because they were probably only going to grade, a couple of dozen papers or however many essays it is that a high school teacher grades. But since we know that the SAT essay isn't designed to measure the same things that a high school essay would be designed to measure, then we know that we probably shouldn't be surprised to find out that the time necessary to grade the SAT essay would be drastically different from the time necessary to grade other types of essays, because everything else about the SAT essay is drastically different from what we would find in a school essay. And obviously, as you can imagine, the fact that the essays are going to be read so quickly and so superficially is going to determine a lot of the choices that I would recommend you make as you write the essay. And we'll talk about those choices over the next few screens. But for now, just to kind of help this idea stick in your head that the essay will be read very quickly, I want to explore the College Board's two main reasons for having its graders do this. The first reason is kind of the obvious one. The College Board has to get a whole lot of essays scored. And without going into too much detail, basically one of the College Board's ways of standardizing the essay grading process is to have every essay be read by at least 2 people, sometimes 3. And so that basically doubles the total amount of reading that has to be done. And I'm sure you can imagine that if the SAT essay graders were in the habit of spending like a whole afternoon or a weekend poring over the fine details of a single SAT essay, then it would take them like a decade or something to grade all the essays from a single test day, which obviously wouldn't work for anybody. And now the second reason is a little bit less obvious, but actually has bigger implications for how we'll attack the essay. And the second reason is something we've talked about before. The College Board needs to find some way to keep the SAT essay scoring standardized. And again, that's hard because essays are inherently subjective, and it's very hard to standardize subjective stuff. So by keeping the workload of the essay graders relatively high, the College Board can actually make sure that the graders don't get bogged down in small details of essays, which would then make it even harder to apply objective standards reliably over and over and over again. Since the graders don't have a ton of time to dive deeply into what every test taker is writing, we'll find that the observable similarities among the high-scoring essays tend to be the kinds of things that a grader could notice by looking at an essay for like 1 or 2 minutes, because that's what they're doing. So the result of all of that is you're going to find these 4 elements playing a major role in determining the score that an essay gets. And that's why these 4 things will each have a screen dedicated to them for the next 4 screens. So let's dive in and talk about the length thing first. Simply put, you're going to find that length is the number one correlating factor when it comes to the score of an SAT essay. For example, if you tell me that an essay is only 3/4 of a page long, then I can tell you with a high degree of certainty that the score for that essay is going to involve at least 1, 2, or 3 out of 8, even if the writing of that 3/4 of a page is just gorgeous in terms of the way things are worded and the clarity of thought and so on, because the lack of length in that situation will prevent graders from awarding a high score. Or if an essay gets a perfect score, I can tell you it's at least 2 pages long, probably closer to like 2.5, 3 pages, just because that's how the SAT essay graders consistently work. But I want to be really clear how I'm saying this. I am not saying that you can just blindly churn out 2 or 3 pages of meaningless garbage and then be guaranteed a high score. Even though the graders aren't going to read super carefully, they are going to read a little bit. And they're, of course, going to notice if what you're saying makes zero sense. So I'm not saying that having at least 2.5 or 3 pages guarantees you a top score. But I am saying that if you want a top score, then one thing you'll have to have is sufficient length to the essay. And when I say sufficient length, I mean you want to shoot for at least 2.5 pages. So let's say you've written, for example, 1.5 pages, something noticeably less than 2 pages. If that's the case, it won't make any real difference to your score how clear and insightful that 1.5 pages is, because the graders simply won't give you the highest marks if you only have that much written. So basically, having sufficient length is necessary for a high score, but doesn't guarantee the high score by itself. But if you don't write enough, then that does basically guarantee that you won't get a high score. And as I've been saying, you basically want to shoot for 2.5 to 3 handwritten pages. Notice I'm not giving you a target length here in terms of word count. And that's because you're going to write the SAT essay by hand. And it really does seem to be the case that when the grader's eyes are moving over the page, they're more taking into account how much of the pages, how many pages are taken up, and not, how densely are the words crammed onto each line of that page. Because when we're talking about length in this case, we're talking about the number of handwritten pages. And again, it really doesn't matter how densely you're writing. And one thing people often ask me is, well, then can I deliberately write maybe 5 words a line or something, only 4 or 5 words a line? The answer is, I don't know, because I never had anybody try that. I've never seen with my own eyes the result when someone actually does it. And all the advice I give you on the SAT is based on things I have specifically seen either work or not work. So I've never seen a person deliberately try to write with huge handwriting and really stretching out how many pages are taken up with a given number of words. I would suspect that if you push that and really write in that sort of stretched out style, then all bets would probably be off in terms of length and number of handwritten pages and so on. But if you're just writing like you normally writing like a regular person, more or less, then the number of handwritten pages is what matters for this rule, and not specifically the number of words. So again, we're thinking in terms of handwritten pages. We want to shoot for 2.5 to 3 handwritten pages. Now, writing more than 3 handwritten pages doesn't seem to give any kind of advantage. There are people who write more than 3 pages, and they generally score pretty high if those 3 pages, have decent quality and organization and everything. But an essay of 3.5 or 4 pages isn't any more likely to score high than an essay of 2.5 or 3 pages. So yeah, again, basically the goal is write 2.5 to 3 handwritten pages. And if you're wondering how you're going to fill up 2.5 to 3 handwritten pages, I'm talking about an argument some other person is making in a passage that you've been forced to read on a Saturday while taking a standardized test, then that leads me to my next point, which is we're going to end up using the 5-paragraph format to write this essay, and a lot of the 5-paragraph format involves some degree of repetition. So let's talk about what that's going to look like. Now, if you're an American high school student or an American English teacher, or really just anybody who does anything with writing high school essays in America, which would probably make you a student, I guess. Anyway, if you're any of those people, then you're probably familiar with what we call the 5-paragraph format. But in case you aren't familiar, it basically works like this. There are 5 paragraphs in the essay, of course, and in the opening paragraph, also called the introduction paragraph, the writer basically states what the rest of the essay will be attempting to prove. And then the next 3 paragraphs after the opening paragraph are each focused on some piece of evidence that helps to prove what was put forth in the first paragraph. And then the final paragraph, the 5th paragraph, just kind of wraps up everything that appeared in the previous 4 paragraphs to kind of remind the reader of what the whole essay has been about. Or in the immortal words of my middle school English teacher, in the 5-paragraph essay, you start out by telling the reader what you're going to tell them. And then for the next 3 paragraphs, you tell them. And then in the final paragraph, you tell them what you just told them. And I would recommend that you modify this classic 5-paragraph format a little bit for purposes of writing the SAT essay, but the basic structure is still going to be the same. So I still recommend that you have an intro paragraph, and I would probably give it a structure very similar to what these 3 bullet points are, more or less in a row. So the first sentence in my intro paragraph would be something that kind of introduces the fact that I'm going to be talking about the structure of the argument made by person X in passage Y provided by the prompt. And then if I already have an idea of some of the things I'm going to be talking about in my supporting body paragraphs, then I would allude to those things in the next few sentences of that first paragraph. And the final sentence or so of my first paragraph would probably be a direct statement of my thesis. And you'll see more detail of how all of that kind of thing would be done in the video that focuses specifically on evidence and reasoning and all of those kinds of things. And you'll also see how other top scoring essay writers have done it in the video that focuses on breaking down top scoring essays. But for now, just take my word for it. I would basically do the intro paragraph more or less like this. Doesn't have to be exactly these things in this order that I have here, but if you don't have any other plans already, then you can more or less use this sort of arrangement for structuring that first paragraph. And it'll work pretty well, and it's not really that different from how most teachers would have you write the first paragraph in a 5-paragraph essay. But the main kind of tweak comes in the body paragraphs. Actually, it's not even really a tweak, it's just sort of like a specific set of things that I would try to discuss in the body paragraphs. So basically, I would have my first couple of body paragraphs be about some kind of evidence and reasoning that are put forward by the author of the passage. And I would have my last body paragraph specifically talk about how the author of the passage appeals to emotion in making his argument. And some American writing teachers might call this how they use pathos or how they use writing style. It doesn't really matter what you call this sort of pathos emotion kind of thing. It's just that I would focus my last body paragraph on the aspects of the argument that are emotional rather than evidence-based. And again, if you don't know what I mean by emotion versus evidence, then we're going to talk about that in the video that's specifically focused on emotion and evidence. But for now, I just want to cover what the structure of this whole thing will look like. And then finally, after those body paragraphs, I would have a conclusion paragraph, which again is the part where you tell them what you just told them. And the conclusion paragraph would sort of wrap up all of the things talked about in the other paragraphs. And if you think back to what we were discussing on the previous screen, when I talked about how important length is, how you want to have at least 2.5 or 3 pages, and I said you might be wondering, how are you going to crank out 2.5 to 3 pages in like 50 minutes? Well, this is a big part of how. Once you know what the format is going to be, then that, of course, makes it easy just by itself. But also, if you look at this format, a lot of it is like kind of repetitive. In the opening paragraph, you're going to mention things that appear in later paragraphs. In the concluding paragraph, you mention the things that appeared in the earlier paragraphs, and so on. That's kind of what the 5-paragraph format gets you. Now, before we move on, I do want to mention I keep calling this the 5-paragraph format because when it's classically taught, it is 5 paragraphs long, opening and then 3 body paragraphs and then a closing paragraph. But it could be a 4-paragraph or 6, 7, whatever number you want. The issue is not really the number of paragraphs. It's the relationship and the sequence among the paragraphs that do appear. So basically, on test day, I want you to write an introductory paragraph and a conclusion paragraph. And I want you to have a certain number of body paragraphs, and I'd like the last of those body paragraphs to be talking about an appeal to emotion. But if you want to have 2 paragraphs before the one that talks about appeal to emotion, or you want to have 4 different pieces of evidence, each with its own paragraph that you talk about before getting to that closing body paragraph and then the final concluding paragraph, any of those things is fine. And like I said, your essay might therefore end up being 6, 7 paragraphs long, technically. But what matters is just that the overall skeleton, the overall structure essentially follows the idea of the 5-paragraph format, the idea of the intro paragraph and then a certain number of body paragraphs and then the conclusion paragraph. And this format is important, again, because we want to structure the essay in such a way that if someone has to read the essay in like a minute or 2, which is what the scorers will have to do, then we want to make it easy for the scorers to be able to move through the different parts of the essay to get an idea of how we tried to structure our writing. And once the grader realizes that you're writing in basically the 5-paragraph format, then she'll be able to say, oh, okay, like I see up here in the opening paragraph, this is where the test taker is laying out the thesis. Okay, I think this sentence here was the thesis. All right, well, it does look like the rest of the essay supports that thesis, so that's good. So, in using this format, you're trying to give the grader the easiest time possible to figure out what you were trying to say and how you tried to support yourself. And I want to add that it's technically possible that you could get a perfect score on the SAT essay and not use any variation of the 5-paragraph format. It's definitely possible, but the vast majority of essays that make perfect scores or near perfect scores use essentially this format. So why would you not? We know that the graders are okay with it. The graders probably like it because, again, it's such an established way that writing is done in high school and college and a relatively easy thing for the grader to latch onto and move around within. So why not do it? And I would much rather have you be focused on the format of your writing and the ideal sequence of these paragraphs than to be focused on what most test takers would be focused on when writing the SAT essay, which is the idea of avoiding mistakes in grammar and punctuation and vocabulary and stuff like that. It's very important to remember that small mistakes in your writing are okay. And by small mistakes, I don't necessarily mean small mistakes in the formatting. As I said, you probably want to stick to that clear 5-paragraph format that makes the organization relatively obvious to the reader. But here I'm talking about other types of mistakes in your writing, the types of mistakes that maybe a high school teacher or a college professor would like knock off 1 or 2 points out of 100 for each time you misspelled a word or used a comma the wrong way. Those are the ones that are basically okay on the SAT essay. In other words, those types of mistakes are very unlikely to affect your score negatively. And to a lot of untrained test takers, that's going to seem kind of strange because they assume that if the College Board is making an essay test, then that test ought to reward the same types of writing that we would see in high school and college, as we've repeated this idea over and over again. And so those people naturally assume that the SAT essay graders would ding your score for the same types of tiny mistakes that would hurt you in a school setting. But once more, we have to remember the people reading your essay are not spending a ton of time focusing on it. In fact, there's a really good chance that whole portions of your essay will never actually be read carefully at all. Whole sentences, perhaps, certainly entire words will be skipped here and there. And once more, it all ties back into the time restrictions placed on the reader and the length and formatting that your essay will feature. It would be hard for anyone to read 2.5 or 3 handwritten pages in only a couple of minutes and then notice all the misspellings or mispunctuations or whatever. And the grader is also not going to have any real incentive to read your essay straight through in the first place, because once the grader picks up on the fact that you're using some variation of the 5-paragraph format, then she'll be able to bounce around quickly to different parts of the essay and just check things out like, yeah, okay, this body paragraph seems like it's talking about something that supports the thesis, so okay, that's great. And the next paragraph is talking about emotion, okay, great. And the small handwritten details of the essay will just sort of wash out. So basically, there's no reason for you to be nervous that you might misspell a word or nervous that you don't know when to use a semicolon or any other kind of thing like that. And it's super important to keep this in mind, because once you recognize that these types of occasional mistakes don't hurt your score, you can now take whatever mental energy you would have put into trying to avoid the mistakes and instead put that mental energy into writing quickly and generating at least 2.5 pages in a given time. Or you can put that mental energy into following the 5-paragraph format or some other thing that will actually help you on test day and raise your score. And in the video where we go through some perfect scoring and high scoring SAT essays provided as examples by the College Board, I'll point out to you some of the small mistakes that those essays involve, and you'll see some proof of what I'm talking about here. So if it sounds a little weird to you at first that the College Board doesn't care about small grammar and spelling mistakes and punctuation mistakes and so on, just bear with me. I will show you proof of that when the time comes. And then the last formatting guideline to keep in mind on test day is the idea that 10 to 15% of your essay should be quotes of the passage that was provided in the prompt. And again, as with all of the other advice in this video, I'm not telling you this because I personally feel like 10 to 15% is a good amount for quotes. I'm telling you this because if you look at the top scoring SAT essays that have been graded by official College Board graders, you will see that in general, on those essays, quotes make up roughly this amount of each essay, roughly 10 to 15%. And so that's what you want to shoot for. Now, the temptation for most untrained test takers and most people who aren't very confident in their writing ability would probably be to spend as much time quoting the passage as possible. And the theory there would probably be, well, we want to write at least 3 pages. Quotes are sort of like free real estate, so why don't I just quote as much of the passage as I can? That sort of maybe seems like a straightforward calculation to a lot of people. But if a quarter or a third or a half of your essay is made up of quotes from the passage, then that sort of automatically means that your essay can't spend enough time explaining to the reader what's actually in those quotes or what the significance of those quotes is for your discussion. And so because of that, some well-meaning trained test takers might think, well, okay, if it's possible to have too many quotations, maybe I'll just err on the side of caution and have basically no quotations, be sort of in like the 0 to 5% range. But the problem with that is it's kind of an overreaction. If you don't have enough quotations in your essay, then there won't be enough raw material from the passage for you to discuss in your essay. So In short, if your job for the essay is to discuss how the argument in the essay is developed, well, you kind of can't do that without specifically pointing to individual phrases in the argument and saying, this sentence here does the following, and then this paragraph later on also does that, or, whatever it is you want to say. Don't don't write what I just said verbatim. This sentence here does the following, and this paragraph later on also does that. I've never actually had anyone write that as a student of mine, so I guess I don't know for a fact that it wouldn't go over well, but I'm just going to go on my instincts and say, yeah, don't quote me there. But you get what I'm trying to say. Like, I'm just sort of generally describing the types of things that you might say. And in order to say those things about the passage, you will sort of automatically have to quote it at least a little bit. And once more, in the top scoring essays, you're going to find that roughly 10 to 15% is given over to quotes. And actually also, something else that just occurred to me, when I'm saying like 10 to 15% should be quotes, I don't mean like the first tenth of the essay should just be a solid block of quotes. I mean, you're going to sprinkle your quotes throughout the essay as you need them to refer to different key aspects of the passage. So you know that 10 to 15% is going to be sort of dispersed throughout the essay. Maybe that was obvious, but I just realized I didn't explicitly say it, so now I have. And so again, just to wrap up this quote thing and drive this home, you want to have some quotes because it shows that you are paying attention to specific details in the passage, and it shows that your discussion of the passage is actually based on details that appear in the passage and not just based on you making up what you think should be in the passage, or something like that. At the same time, you don't want to have too much of the essay be taken up by quotes, because that means you're not able to put enough of your own thoughts into the discussion. And you don't want to have too few quotes throughout the essay, because that means you're not paying enough attention to what's actually written in the original passage. And remember, again, the goal with all of this is just to look as much like other top scoring essays as possible, so that when the grader looks at your essay, every single detail they consider of your essay is like, oh yeah, that reminds me of every other top scoring essay I've ever seen. I'm just going to go ahead and give this a top score. That's the goal. And before I move on to the final part of this video, which is basically going to be like showing you how to put all of this into an actual plan for execution on test day and then kind of wrapping everything up, before I do all of that, I just want to make it clear one more time that this 10 to 15% thing is a rough guideline. The point of this guideline is not that you should actually count all of the words in the essay and all of the words in your quotes and then make sure that the one is like 10% of the other. That isn't the point at all. The point is just have a general sense of how much you're quoting, and it should be roughly 10 to 15%. You're not going to have a ton of time to sit there and count up all your words anyway, which actually leads us to the next slide, which is all about what you ought to be spending your time doing on test day. And you may be wondering, since this slide is called What to Do on Test Day, like, why couldn't this just be the whole video? Well, and you could have, skipped everything we talked about up until now. The reason for that is what we're going to discuss on this screen kind of builds on everything we've talked about so far. So, what to do on test day, building on what we have talked about so far. From the moment that the time starts counting down on the essay task on test day, it's very critical to remember that you really have to write a lot in order to have any chance of getting a top score. As we said before, you're going to need to aim for writing 2.5 to 3 handwritten pages. And of course, you're also going to have to look at the passage. You probably want to read the whole passage all the way through once, and then you may have to glance back and reread other parts of it later on as you continue your writing. So that's also going to eat up some time, of course. And you've got 50 minutes for the section. So if you imagine 5 minutes or so of reading, possibly more than that, then you can see that the test really doesn't give you a whole bunch of time. You're not going to have a ton of time to reflect or daydream. You certainly aren't going to have time to write the essay once as a rough draft and then like rewrite a good draft. You won't have time for any of that. So from the beginning, you have to remember, you got to hit the ground running and go through the steps in this process without like taking time to pause and look around or reflect or do any of those kinds of things. So with that idea in mind, and it doesn't really take any time at all from the beginning, just to remember that length is essential. You can sort of do that as a background process from the first second. And then also with that first second, you want to look through the prompt and find the College Board's statement of the passage's thesis. Remember, we saw this a couple times on an earlier screen. Basically, at some point, the prompt is going to say, write an essay in which you explain how blah, blah, blah builds an argument to persuade the audience that XYZ. And whatever comes after the word that, the XYZ, that's the passage's thesis, according to the College Board. And as we said, everything that you're going to do when you're explaining that the argument is constructed well, it all hangs off the idea of what that thesis is. You can't say that the original argument is constructed well if you don't agree with the College Board on what the argument is actually arguing. Or at any rate, you can't say that in a way that's going to get you a top score, which is the whole point of all of this. So you're going to read the College Board statement of the passage's thesis, and you're going to keep that in your mind throughout the rest of this entire process. Then you're going to read the passage with the College Board's statement of the thesis in mind, and you're going to look out for evidence, reasoning, and appeals to emotion. And right now you might be saying, Mike, you've mentioned this idea of evidence, reasoning, and appeals to emotion multiple times in this video, but you haven't told us what they actually are. That is very true. That's a whole other video because I didn't want to make this video even longer than it is. But basically, as you are going through the passage provided by the College Board and keeping in mind what the thesis is as stated by the College Board, you are going to be looking for the specific bits of information, the specific wording that the author of the passage uses to prove the thesis. And that's going to break down into evidence, reasoning, and emotion, which again, you will see in the video dedicated to those ideas. And you don't have to memorize every single piece of evidence or every single piece of reasoning. You don't have to worry if you misclassify a piece of reasoning as a piece of evidence. None of that is super important. It's more like the evidence, reasoning, and emotion ideas are just ways to help you filter through what you're reading and start organizing those concepts in your own mind. And it's also perfectly fine if you miss one or several of these pieces of evidence or whatever, because the passage will contain many more specific ideas than you can possibly comment on intelligently in your essay. So it's fine. You're not going to catch everything. You don't need to catch everything. What you are probably going to start to notice is that the different pieces of evidence and reasoning in the essay can kind of be roughly classified into a few different groups. So you might notice, hey, gosh, there's a whole bunch of references to statistics in this passage. The author keeps saying 30% of people who think X also do Y. Or did you know that a polar bear is 90% more likely to be left-handed than a house cat or something, whatever. So if the author includes those kinds of statements often, then you might say to yourself, okay, I'm starting to notice there's a lot of statistics being used in this essay. Fine. Or the author might mention a variety of historical events, which you could recognize, of course, because there would often be specific dates and place names, the names maybe of famous people in there. Or the author herself might quote other people who've written on the topic and use those quotes as part of her evidence in the original passage. Or there could be references to scientific research as evidence. You get the idea. There's a lot of different types of evidence that you will be able to observe in the passage depending on the subject matter of the passage. And you don't have to make a chart of this or anything, or write down, okay, here, here, and here, I think I saw something related to scientific evidence. And then here, 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 and here, I saw something about history. So you don't have to keep a strict tally on any of that. The point, again, is just read the passage, thinking in terms of the fact that the passage is trying to prove the thesis as stated by the College Board, and then just sort of casually start to notice, roughly, without putting too much energy into it, the types of evidence that the author is using in the original passage. And remember what we said about how you're going to use the 5-paragraph format, because those types of evidence that you notice are going to play into the fact that we're going to use the 5-paragraph format in order to structure the essay. And if you recall, I said in the body paragraphs, all the body paragraphs except the last one are going to be related to different types of evidence that you observe in the passage. So if you observe that the passage makes a lot of use of historical evidence, then one of the body paragraphs will be about how the author used historical evidence. If you observe a lot of statistical citations, then one of the paragraphs in your thing will be about how the author uses statistics, or whatever it might be. So again, once you've got an idea of which types of evidence you want to talk about, which types of evidence you see the author relying on, then you need to figure out, well, which ones of those types of evidence do I want to mention in my body paragraphs? And you want to pick at least 2 of these, but you could pick 3, 4, 5, whatever. Basically, each one of them that you pick is potentially another body paragraph that you'll be able to write, assuming you have enough time. And that means, of course, more space you're going to be taking up on the paper, which is ultimately the goal, because length is super important. So yeah, basically at this point, you would have read through the passage thinking in terms of the College Board statement of the thesis, and you would have started to notice, okay, there's some quotes from famous people here. So one type of evidence that the passage uses is reference to credible authority figures from the past. So one of my body paragraphs is going to be about that. That's basically where you're at. Notice that you can do all of this reading and thinking without actually writing anything down at this point. To this point, I would not have written anything down. If you want to write things down because you feel like it helps, I wouldn't say don't write things down, but what I would specifically say is don't feel like you need to write any of this down so far. Like, don't feel like you need to take any notes on any of this stuff. It's all about just getting a general, superficial overview of what you feel is going on in the passage and how that relates to the College Board's statement of what the passage is trying to argue. And once you've got all that, which hopefully is somewhere in the, let's say, 3 to 10 minute range. If you read really, really fast, then it could be only 3 minutes. More of an average speed of reading could be more like 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes. But yeah, once you've gone through all of that and you are ready to start writing the essay, then I'm going to recommend that you just jump right in and write the opening sentence of the essay. So again, I would not do any pre-planning before actually starting to draft the essay. And the reason I wouldn't do any pre-planning is we already know roughly what we're going to say. We know we're going to follow the 5-paragraph format. We know that each of the body paragraphs is going to be about a type of evidence that we noticed. We know that the final body paragraph is going to be about how the author plays on people's emotions. And we know the concluding paragraph is going to be basically a repetition of everything that came before it. So what is there to plan, really? Because each of those paragraphs basically stands on its own, arguably until the concluding paragraph, but by the time you're writing the concluding paragraph, you've already written everything else, so you don't have to plan the fact that you've already written something. So yeah, since each of those pieces is basically a separate component that doesn't rely too heavily on any of the other components, there's no need to plan out all the components. Just dive right into the first paragraph, start writing it, then you'll start writing a body paragraph and so on. So the first paragraph, of course, begins with the first sentence, sort of by definition. And in that first sentence, I would recommend that you quote something from the passage and say that the author successfully argues whatever the College Board's thesis statement was. And you'll see multiple examples of this in the College Board provided top-scoring sample essays. But basically, it would be something like this. In the prologue to his book, Never Split the Difference, author Chris Voss effectively demonstrates that, quote, negotiation and thoughtful, principled conflict lie at the root of most successful professional relationships, end quote. So yeah, just basically something along those lines, that kind of structure. And that's it. That's your first sentence out of the way. And then we want to build out the rest of that opening paragraph as we might do it for school. So we might have a sentence or two that alludes to the types of evidence you're going to mention in the individual body paragraphs. Or you might take another quote from the passage and just basically sort of repeat the idea of the original sentence, but with different words and so on. And when you have completed that opening paragraph, of course, you're going to dive right into the first body paragraph. That first body paragraph is going to be about one of the pieces of evidence that you identified back here, one of the things that you want to talk about. Again, these could be historical facts, statistical facts, or personal experiences of the author, whatever one of the things is that you noticed the author kept doing in the passage and, decided you wanted to talk about that first in your first body paragraph. And in this first body paragraph about the types of evidence that the author uses, I would start out the opening sentence of the paragraph by saying, author so-and-so relies heavily on personal anecdotes to help establish the seriousness of the problem she's describing, some sort of introduction statement like that. And that sets up that the rest of the paragraph is going to be about personal anecdotes. And then the rest of the paragraph can just be sort of quotes of parts of those anecdotes with a sentence or two after each quote explaining how that particular quote is an example of what the whole paragraph is about, and so on. Again, you can watch the video on evidence, reasoning, and emotion as they're used on this test for more on that. And after you finish that first evidence body paragraph, then you go into the second evidence body paragraph, possibly with an opening statement like, in addition to personal anecdotes, author so-and-so also repeatedly refers to the results of psychological studies conducted on hamsters, or whatever other type of evidence you want to devote a second body paragraph to. And you basically just kind of loop and repeat that process for each evidence-based body paragraph that you want to talk about. As you'll recall, when we talked about the whole 5-paragraph format aspect, we said it doesn't have to be exactly 5 paragraphs, which means it doesn't have to be exactly 2 evidence-based body paragraphs. It could be 3, it could be 4, it could be only 1 if you're writing enough length in that one and then everything else you write to get the whole essay up to 2.5 pages or so. But anyway, when you have finished all of the evidence-based body paragraphs, I would put the emotion-based body paragraph as my final body paragraph, or in other words, the final paragraph before the conclusion paragraph. And I would put this paragraph in this position because that's where it is on a whole bunch of top-scoring essays that I've seen. And because it seems like the top-scoring essays make a point of discussing how the author uses emotion in trying to convince the reader. Sometimes the top-scoring sample essays even refer to this as the passage's use of pathos, which may be a term you recognize if your English teacher also uses it. But if not, they're just talking about emotions or stylistic flourishes, writing style, any kind of thing along those lines. And I would not skip this part of the discussion if I were you, again, just because top scoring essays generally make some reference to how the passage uses emotion. So if you want to write a top scoring essay, you should do that too. And it's the same kind of thing here that you did for each of the evidence-based body paragraphs. You might say something like, the author seeks to create a sense of calm and well-being in the reader so that the reader will be easier to persuade. And the author does this through the use of soothing imagery such as, quote, fields of dandelions, end quote, whatever, just whatever types of emotional things you see, you quote those and you expand on why you picked those particular quotes and what you feel that that's doing to the reader's emotions when they're reading the passage. And I guess you could, in theory, have more than one emotion-based body paragraph if you felt like it. Like you could have one paragraph on how the author uses fear and one paragraph on how the author incites a feeling of love or, whatever. But I would just do one total emotion paragraph myself because that is what generally succeeds and, why deviate from what succeeds? And then finally, when all of those body paragraphs are written and you are basically looking at the essay that you have churned out sitting in front of you, then it is time to write the concluding paragraph. And you can produce the concluding paragraph basically by restating the ideas in the other paragraphs. And you may want to add a small quote or two in that concluding paragraph as well. And then that's basically it. And you may be looking at this and thinking to yourself, well, wait, so there's no proofreading, there's no real reflection on what the passage originally said. There's no real focus on how different paragraphs can transition to each other. And if you're thinking those things, then yes, you are absolutely right. There's none of those things because this is the SAT essay and the task of writing a top scoring essay does not require us to do any of those types of things that we would normally associate with high level writing in real life. On top of that, those things we'd associate with high level writing in real life take up time. And on this test, we don't have a lot of time. We need to crank out 2.5 or 3 pages. And that's going to take most test takers most of the allotted time. And at this stage, you may be fully understanding why so many colleges and universities don't really pay any attention to what the SAT essay score is. Anyhow, with all of that said, let's go ahead and wrap up the ideas that we discussed in this video. While you're working on the essay on test day, remember that you're going to spend most of 50 minutes writing this essay, and the people who read it are going to spend under 5 minutes reading it, probably more like a minute or two, just sort of going through it and seeing if it looks like what top scoring essays always look like. So the two main ways that you make your essay look like top scoring essays are to stick to the length and format guidelines in this video. And also, like we said, 10 to 15% taken up with quotes, and you need to say that the argument in the passage is successful, those types of things. And in order to get all of this done, you really can't afford to take any breaks or pause and look around or anything like that. You have to hit the ground running doing the things we talked about on the previous screen so that you can crank out almost 3 pages in the allotted time. And part of working quickly is keeping in mind at any moment that you should only be focusing on the specific sentence or paragraph that you're writing. You really don't have to be thinking about how the rest of the essay is going to play out because you already know it's going to be that modified 5-paragraph format. So what that means is if you're in the middle of writing a body paragraph about how the author relies on statistics, that's it. That's all that paragraph is about. And then once you finish that paragraph, you can stop thinking about how the author uses statistics and go on to the next thing you wanted to say that the author was using as a piece of evidence. And then you write that body paragraph. And when that's done, you forget all about that. And you go on to the next paragraph and so on and so on. And if you keep that kind of mechanized automatic mindset, then you'll find it much easier to generate the necessary length in the amount of time. Also, along those lines, there's no point pre-planning or sketching anything out or anything, again, because you're just going to use that modified 5-paragraph format, and that format lends itself to just sort of jumping in and getting started, and then before you know it, you'll be done. Also, along those same lines, as you're writing, don't worry oh, wait, should there have been 2 T's in that word? Or did I forget to put a period at the end of the previous sentence? Don't worry about any of those kinds of small writing mistakes that a real teacher or professor might penalize you for in a real writing situation because the SAT essay grading doesn't take those things into account. And for that matter, while we're talking about not sweating small mistakes, I would like to remind you one more time that you may not even need to sweat the SAT essay at all. And you can go back and watch the beginning of the video if you don't remember why that's the case. But basically, most schools don't require the SAT essay, and of the schools that do require it, none of them that I'm aware of can show any data that indicates that it actually plays any role in whether you get accepted to the school or not. So I will repeat my advice that if I were you, I wouldn't be worried about the SAT essay until I was at least sure that I had basically everything going right in the multiple choice portions of the test, because that part of the SAT will definitely affect your ability to get into the schools that you would like to get into. And then finally, remember to watch the other essay videos for further elaboration of the things that we talked about in this video. Specifically, watch the video on evidence, reasoning, and emotion if you aren't specifically familiar with those types of concepts as they relate to making arguments, because that's going to determine how you create your body paragraphs. And also watch the video analysis of the sample top scoring essays provided by the College Board so that you can see all of this actually in action against real SAT prompts and be certain that it all actually works. And that takes care of that. So thank you very much for watching this video. I will see you in the next one.